At long last, the V8 is in the truck, and it runs and drives. It's practically finished, right? Well, first up, it needs radiator fans. I'm using these cheap electric ones off eBay and the original 4.3 radiator. It might be a little inadequate long term, but I'm just gonna see how it all does. I wired the fans to the battery with these auxiliary posts, a relay, and a switch in the cab. They're a little loud, but even on a hot day, they seem to keep the engine cool in traffic. Another thing that needs fixing is the four-wheel drive. On these trucks, the vacuum actuator that connects the front differential to the drive axles inevitably fails. Instead of just replacing it, I'm using a locking cable from Napa and a guide I found online to very cheaply turn that into a manual front axle. I noticed a bit of a strange sound when the engine was running, like a tapping, and I realized the heads on the torque converter bolts I used were a little long and were hitting the inspection plate. All I did was put washers in between the inspection cover and the transmission, and everything worked out. Started doing the usual basic tuning, but before I do too much, this truck needs an exhaust. It is still running open manifolds, and it is way too loud. Just like everything else in this truck, this exhaust is going to be a Frankenstein. I'm using this 3-inch in, dual 2-inch out muffler from Summit. There's not much to this muffler, so I'm hoping it's going to be quiet enough. Now that we have a plan and a pile of parts, there's a whole lot of cutting and welding to be done. I try to do this as cheap as possible, but there's a lot of bends to get around a lot of little things in the truck, and it was not an easy process. The Y pipe was by far the biggest challenge. The point where the driver's side meets the main down pipe is probably going to need some work later on, but for the purposes of testing, this should do just fine. It is basically as short as possible, and these short little 2-inch pipes are going to come out on the passenger side between the body and the frame. That way, there's no loss of ground clearance. After all that cutting and welding and cutting and welding and fitting and welding and cutting and fitting and welding, we have a pile of exhaust parts ready for some paint, some heat wrap, and then to be mounted on the truck. I spent a long time trying to figure out a flange for this manifold. In the end, I used a standard donut gasket and a standard bell flange by just cutting off the flare at the bottom of the manifold. It seals okay so far. And here we are. The exit is right behind the passenger door, which is a little questionable and pretty funny looking, but I kinda like that. It's the only point I could get them to come over the frame. Those pipes come over the transfer case cross member, through the muffler, which has hangers in the old catalytic converter mounts, and right in front of that is that Y pipe. The whole driver's side pipe is 2 1/4 inches, and the passenger side pipe is 2 1/4 to that main 2 3/4 inch down pipe. Exhaust sounds good. Outside the vehicle, it's pretty quiet on the driver's side and kind of loud on the passenger side, so that's a little funny. But after driving it around some, there's a new problem. Off idle, it runs well, but it developed a very lean idle. It only runs well with this choke flap damn near all the way closed. I could not find any vacuum leaks. I took some time hunting problems, and I could not find anything. This carburetor was just rebuilt and just running okay. Cleaned out the usual suspects in it, and no change. So my best guess is an intake manifold leak, which means some of this has to come apart again. At this point, I decided if I'm going to change the intake manifold gasket, I might as well change the intake manifold. I got this Edelbrock Performer off Craigslist for $50 and rebuilt this Edelbrock 600 CFM 1406 that has been sitting around for a couple months. Now we have a freshly rebuilt 4-barrel and a matching intake manifold. Time to get the old manifold off. Lucky for me, this already had an aftermarket gasket, so it was actually very easy to clean everything up. But there was one trick remaining. See, this manifold is for older Chevy heads. In these bow tie heads, the center 4 bolts are more vertical than the old ones, which means some modification. I made a set of these aluminum wedges. On older cylinder heads, all the intake manifold bolts come in at a 45-degree angle. In 1987, they changed the center 4 to a 72-degree angle. So I made these 27-degree wedges and bored out and then eventually slotted the center 4 holes on the intake manifold so that everything would fit. It's a bit of a strange modification, but I believe everything will be just fine. I also modified the throttle bracket I had previously made to the different geometry of the new intake manifold. So the engine is cleaned up, the intake manifold is installed, the new carburetor goes on, and all the other parts are reconnected. And it fires right up. That's beautiful. Now the engine has a much better flowing intake manifold and a 4-barrel carburetor. Time to go out for another drive. I spent some time driving it around and noticed it had some problems at high RPM. Anything above maybe 3,500 RPM, even in park, it would start to stumble and fall on its face. I rechecked the carb calibration, went through the whole ignition system, tested the ignition coil and tried a spare with no change, replaced all of the spark plug wires and spark plugs, and while it seemed to idle a little better after that, still no change at high RPM. You can see the dipstick coming out. Because I wasn't sure about the oil capacity here, I ended up overfilling. Oops. That high RPM problem is still kicking my butt though. I don't know what to do about it. I ran another compression test on the engine, and while the rings are definitely old, at least the numbers are consistent. I drove the truck around for a while and tried different configurations of springs and rods, trying to find something. Trying to hunt down that high RPM stumble. Well, in all that driving around, I broke it again. So, trying to chase out that high RPM stumble, I was driving up this very steep hill at a pretty high engine speed, and it just stopped moving. I didn't hear any dramatic sounds, none of the gauges did anything crazy. It just would not move forward anymore. I checked the engine and transmission fluid and looked all around it and didn't see anything wrong. So I put the truck in first gear and stepped on it hard. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 RPM, it started to hold itself on the hill. So definitely a transmission or torque converter problem. So instead of calling a friend for help, what I did is put the transfer case into low gear, and between 3,000 and 4,000 RPM, drove that thing through the hills all the way home. Once I was off that main hill, I got it back in two-wheel high and second gear and drove the rest of the way. I made sure there was enough fluid in the transmission and did the obvious tests, but couldn't find anything wrong. So I hooked a pressure gauge up to the transmission, and while the pressures look good, the TV valve does not appear to be working. Let's get the pan off and see what it looks like in there. Well, the clutches are toast, but I don't see any metal in the pan. The TV valve is definitely stuck, but that does not explain the lack of movement. I believe there's internal damage to the torque converter, because that best explains the symptoms of it only moving at high RPMs and it doing that in all gears with full line pressure. This thing will not let me love it. So it looks like I'm going to have to put on my big boy pants and do what has to be done. The next step is going to be rebuilding this transmission.